It was Tuesday, November 12th, 2013, just after 9:03 a.m., when the alarms at First Central Savings on the corner of 14th Street and Marigold Avenue in downtown San Paloma, California, started their alarm. Customers who had come in for quick deposits and older tellers with cash-dulling habits of habit froze in place. Outside, a delivery truck idled at 1426 Marigold, its driver checking his manifest. Inside, Royal Dean, a 34-year-old senior account manager, was balancing a ledger in the glass-paneled office at 1424 Marigold Avenue, Unit 3B, when a volley of gunfire sent him and everyone else sprawling. To the public, Royal had always been the quiet professional. Crisp shirts, an undercut so neatly kept it looked military, and a laugh that surfaced rarely but genuinely. His apartment at 228 Westlake Court, Apartment 2, was the kind of place that suggested order. Precisely folded shirts in the wardrobe, a bookshelf ordered by author nationality, a bonsai in the window. He'd immigrated with his parents from Lagos a dozen years earlier, earned an economics degree at St. Augustine State, and climbed the rigid ladder of banking with diligence and an uneventful ruthlessness. He lived alone and kept to a strict routine. A morning run-down Cedar Promenade, cereal at 6:30, the 812 bus from the corner of Ridge and Hollis to the office. That morning, the robbery was over in 9 minutes. 3 men in dark hoodies and clear masks, 2 at the counters, and 1 pacing the office with the impatient energy of a man who knows he has to be elsewhere, fired a flurry into the ceiling when a teller fumbled with a die pack. Panic in a bank looks like a body forgetting how to move. Screams overlapped with the metallic clank of cash drawers and the sudden, unbearable silence after gunshots. When the robbers ran out through the revolving doors, the city's coffee shop patrons stared at the motionless forms on the marble floor and, for reasons no camera could explain, someone dialed 911 and then called their cousin, their boss, their mother. But the tragedy that would follow wasn't just the bullets. 2 staff members died on the polished tile that morning. Carla Espinoza, 28, a single mother who lived at 3646 Banyan Way, and Thomas "Tommy" Hargreaves, 62, who'd been a teller for 37 years and lived on a quiet cul-de-sac, 7, Linden Place. The coroner's report listed a 3-inch perforation to the sternum for Tommy and multiple shrapnel wounds for Carla. The bank door bore acrid black fingerprints. The surveillance footage, grainy and obstructed by the die-pack explosion, offered nothing conclusive. Silhouettes, a flash of a yellow jacket in the reflection of the ATM glass, a shoe print near the planter that could have come from any size 9 boot. 3 days later, police arrested a man who worked 2 blocks from the bank. Alexander Lex Farrow, 27, a habitual offender living in a group house at 18 Rosario Lane. Lex had been seen in the area and had previous felony convictions. He was arrested on suspicion of armed robbery. But Lex was not the end of the story. On the 6th day after the robbery, an eyewitness named Darnell Pierce came forward and told detectives that Royal Dean, the person they had seen at the bank on most mornings, the warm, familiar face of the accounts department, had been at the scene and not as a victim. Pierce described Royal as watching and talking with the man in the yellow jacket. Pierce's statement, which would later become the fulcrum of Royal's fate, placed Royal at the revolving door at 9:05 a.m., his hands invisible in the crowd. The city wanted answers. The press, local tabloids, then regional networks hungry for a scaffolding of faces they could point to, framed a story that fit old patterns. A foreign-born banker, an inexplicably convenient presence at the bank during a violent heist. Banker arrested in wake of massive downtown heist, blared one headline. Another framed the implication as nearly certain. Insider link? Eyewitness says bank employee was in robbery. The public, already hungry for closure, accepted a simple narrative, a man in the system betraying it. Royal insisted, emphatically, in interviews he never sought, that he was a survivor, not a conspirator. He remembered the smell of burnt paper and the metallic taste of fear. He remembered pulling a dead woman's hand into his lap and calling for help with fingers that would never stop trembling. But memory is light. The courthouse prefers documentation. The eyewitness testimony of Darnell Pierce carried weight. Pierce was a corner habitual, living at 3 Magnolia Alley, with a resume of police encounters that suggested unreliability. He had, however, a photograph of Royal on his phone, a selfie outside the bakery on Marigold taken the week before. He pointed at Royal in the surveillance stills and said, "That's him." The prosecutor was Aisha Whitcomb, a career litigant known for her ferocious cross-examinations and political ambitions. Whitcomb's office was at 3755 Pacific Avenue, Suite 402. Her dossier on the case was a litany of cause and effect. Eyewitness says Royal at scene. Royal's consistent presence in the bank, Lex Farrow's arrest, and a suspiciously timed wire transfer from Shadow account linked to one of Lex's known associates. Whitcomb did not have a smoking gun. She did have a narrative arc most jurors would find legible. Royal's defense counsel, a public defender named Marcus Heller with an office in the basement of the county building at 1125 Whitaker Street, was earnest but overworked. He subpoenaed phone logs showing Royal's phone pinged a cell tower downriver at 8:51 a.m. and a Metro Transit card showing a swipe at 8:58 a.m. But the prosecution had the more charismatic story and a jury whose prejudice could be nudged without obvious force. In cross-examination, Whitcomb emphasized Royal's accent, his foreign-sounding name, and his unusually quick lifestyle turnover. A move, a new watch, a deposit at a high-interest account. The underlying ingredients were laid bare. Fear, suspicion, and a city that loves a villain with a face. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The tapes, the arguments, the speeches, all of it became fodder for a press fascinated by neat arcs, betrayal, guilt, fall. On July 2nd, 2014, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on charges of felony murder and armed robbery. Royal Dean was sentenced to 10 years in state prison, to be served at Southern Ridge Correctional Facility, a 2-hour bus ride southeast of San Paloma in a low scrubland outside Valle Verde. The judge, an affable man named Paul Henley who lived on 1012 Oak Ridge Drive, read the sentence with a cadence that suggested he, too, had accepted the tidy narrative. The thing about being declared guilty is that it lays a concrete question. For Royal, innocence dug itself underground like a root trying to find water. In prison, he was raw and alert. The world had given him a label, convict, murder accomplice, that he learned to stare at without flinching. He learned the names of runs, where to get contraband cigarettes, and which guards at Southern Ridge were prone to brutality. He went through the formal indignities, the strip searches, the rationed showers, the early head counts where the air smelled of bleach and human patience. He also learned how to survive without being allowed to talk about survival openly. He wrote letters, one to his mother that never made it, letters to his friends that bounced back, a single, thin missive that reached Marcus Heller complaining of prosecutorial misconduct and a lack of evidence. The appeals process crawled like a mosquito. His legal options were limited. Ineffective counsel, prosecutorial error, witness recantation. There was one thread to tug at. Darnell Pierce's testimony had been shaky. Pierce's statements and depositions contradicted other versions he had told in alleys and at the liquor store. He'd been arrested for a public intoxication, charged 2 months before the trial. But none of that mattered when the jury had already seen an accused man and not the system. Prison applies time differently. For Royal, the hours were surgical. He kept his head down, avoided contraband deals, joined a prison book club, and learned how to write. He wrote with a concentrated ferocity, observations, lists, names, addresses. He mapped in his head the city that had imprisoned him. He did not go mad. So much has become deliberate. The prison library fed him legal manuals he could scarcely believe were available to inmates. He studied precedent and wrote to organizations about wrongful convictions. When parole denied him release after the first petition, a thin fury took root. On October 18th, 2023, after serving 10 years and 9 months with good behavior credits, after dozens of denied appeals, after a final clemency petition whose letters stacked like dry leaves, Royal walked out of Southern Ridge Correctional Facility. He was not the same man who had walked into First Central Savings that morning in 2013. Some things had hardened him. the implacable knowledge of being expendable, the sharp taste of injustice. Other parts had softened into calibration. He understood people by the way they arranged their mail, by which doorways they used. He had the methodical patience of someone who'd learned to count time and play tectonics. He moved back to San Paloma, to a small 2-bedroom unit he rented anonymously at 52 Harborview Lane, a walk up above an inconspicuous tailor shop run by Mrs. Cato. He got a job doing night security at the Municipal Archives on 801 Sycamore, which meant he studied old property deeds and night maps and developed a deep, private knowledge of who owned what in the city. Night work fed his long hours of planning. He learned which businesses had cameras, which had night guards, which had low-visibility exterior lighting. The city's social topography became his atlas. If you want to know where people slept, you could ask Royal, and he'd point to a list of streets with exact addresses. He learned the distance from Marigold to the alley behind 214 Ridge, the sound of buses along Hollis, the fact that the alley behind the old cotton warehouse had a loose grate that could be removed with the right set of pliers. When he wasn't working nights, Royal haunted the corners of the city in daylight, like a man trying to reacquaint himself with a texture of air that wasn't prison. He found the people who mattered. He found Lex Farrow at a halfway house on 119 Walnut Street and watched the man hollow out like a candle. Lex, who had been prosecuted as the primary robber at the outset, but had cut a deal and testified against others, was now living under an assumed name and working in a construction crew. Lex's eyes glimmered with the knowledge of having been used. Darnell Pierce, the eyewitness whose testimony had lit the spark of Royal's prosecution, had been shot in a street fight in 2018 and survived. He lived in a single-room occupancy at 420 3rd Avenue. He had come into money in small increments and spent it on bottle service and sneakers. He was brittle and easy to wake. To some people, revenge is the only language left where justice fails. To others, it's a fever that burns more than the wound. Royal's vow was neither poetic nor theatrical. It was precise. He promised himself he would punish everyone, and those related to them that framed him and the system that punished him. An elliptical sentence in a letter he never sent, written in a grocery store ballpoint in the margins of a library book. He meant it without bravado. He didn't plan to be loud. He planned to be inevitable. Royal began with names, and names became addresses, and addresses became clusters that clustered into a map of culpability in his mind. The list was not long. It was surgical. First, Darnell Pierce, eyewitness, 420 3rd Avenue, room 12. Second, Lieutenant Harold Green, lead detective in the case, Station House 6, 2339 Brookline Road. Third, Aisha Whitcomb, the prosecutor, office at 3755 Pacific Avenue, Suite 402, home on 47 Willowcrest Drive. Fourth, Marcus Heller, the public defender, county building basement, 1125 Whitaker Street, home on 88 Crestridge Lane. Fifth, Judge Paul Henley, county courthouse, 600 Justice Way, home at 1012 Oak Ridge Drive. Sixth, the bank First Central Savings, 1424 Marigold Avenue, downtown San Paloma. Seventh, Lex Farrow, halfway house, 119 Walnut Street. Eighth, Carla Espinosa's surviving relatives, a list Royal felt uncertain about, but put down anyway. He marked them on paper, then on a dry erase board in his Harborview Lane kitchen, connecting lines like a detective who had finally forgiven himself enough to become a detective. He didn't go straight away to intimidation or violence. He began with exposure. Royal started small. He sent anonymous packets by courier, thick envelopes with printed copies of Darnell's contradictory statements, notes about prosecutorial laziness, a timeline showing who could have been where. He sent them to 2 local journalists, to a civil liberties group at 112 Harbor Plaza, and, most daringly, to the office of the San Paloma Innocence Project, a nonprofit he'd once written to from prison with a list of inconsistencies that had been ignored. The packets carried no threats and no fingerprints. They carried a patient insistence. Look again. The Innocence Project opened his packet with the polite indifference of an organization awash in such claims. But the journalist, Lena McCullough of the San Paloma Ledger, who had built a reputation on exposing small-town trays of corruption, smelled the story. Lena's office was at 3 Willow Lane, and she called. She interviewed Royal under a fabric of anonymity at a coffee shop on the block. The city smelled of rain. He gave her the names, the documents, and the notion that a man with a clean file had been railroaded. Lena pursued it slowly, and then suddenly, she found phone logs that didn't align. She dug up a surveillance angle that suggested the surveillance cameras outside First Central Savings had been repositioned the day after the robbery. She found a memo in the bank's internal archives indicating an audit had occurred 2 weeks before the heist, a memo originally buried in a stack of monthly reports at 801 Sycamore, the municipal archives where Royal now worked nights. The paper trail flashed bright. Lena ran a feature. A promise of safety, a man framed? Online comments split predictably. Some said, come on, guilt proven. Others argued, investigate. The Innocence Project opened a soft file on the case. The police reopened the initial reports under the polite pressure of public attention. The DA's office, sensing headlines, announced a review. It should have been a vindication. Instead, it was a microscope. People who had dragged Royal's life into evidence now found their own pasts under inspection. Detective Harold Green had, in his early career, been criticized for sloppy chain-of-custody procedures. Aisha Whitcomb, the prosecutor, had an old disciplinary note from a case in 2009 where a witness's testimony was later recanted. Marcus Heller's defense of Royal had been, in hindsight, minimal. He'd been assigned the case with 2 others that same week. Lex Farrow's deal was suddenly suspiciously beneficial. Darnell Pierce's bar tab receipts in the months following the robbery showed large expenses coinciding with a period he had no legitimate income. Lena's articles made the story go viral beyond San Paloma. People began to ask inconvenient questions. That was when the slow veneer of civility cracked. Threats arrived at Lena's office. Plain white envelopes with nothing inside and a return address that was a P.O. box in Valle Verde. Someone broke into the mailbox at the Innocence Project and stole a file. A man in a black truck followed the DA's car for 3 days. Someone painted the words "perverted justice" on the courthouse steps in the night. Royal watched the public fallout and felt a hollow satisfaction that was not joy. He had not asked for this. He had only wanted the record to be set straight. Then Darnell Pierce disappeared. He vanished without fuss. The single-room occupancy at 420 3rd Avenue was cleared out by the landlord the next week. His few possessions sold off for overdue rent. No forwarding address. An old friend of Pierce's said he might have skipped town. Another, more worried, whispered that Pierce had been taken care of. The police said nothing. Royal's hands tightened in a small fist that would leave no scars. He was not a man who liked ambiguity. Then the threats turned personal. Marcus Heller got a brick through his basement window. Judge Henley found a sheet across his yard with a child's doll nailed to it on a stake, eyes gouged out like some grotesque totem. Aisha Whitcomb received photos of her daughter's middle school recital with notes. We see you. Lex Farrow was found unconscious in a motel room in Eastvale with a cracked rib and no one to claim him. Royal knew then, with a quiet, edged certainty, that someone was carrying out their own reprisals. At first he feared he was being framed again. If someone else had taken up a vendetta and used his name, that was the sort of thing men like Royal had to watch for. But the incidents had a different signature, methodical, precise, and anonymous. Whoever orchestrated these acts had legal knowledge and a taste for cruelty. It felt, to Royal, both targeted and sometimes accidental. No one wanted to be a smear on a courthouse step for the long haul. They wanted to be frightened into silence. He considered telling the police. He didn't. He had learned, in a decade of being considered a criminal, that calling those who had once convicted you was like asking wolves to help you with a thorn. Instead, he watched. He listened to the city the way a surgeon listens for subtle changes in a patient's breathing. He traced calls and wired his nights with observation. What Royal did next was not dramatic. He did not strap on a mask and stalk the DA like a figure in a movie. He used the pen and the phone, the leverage of information, and the inevitable human tendencies toward greed and fear. He began to collect what people were hiding. He found that Detective Green had been friendly with a private security firm, Paloma Secure, headquartered at 505 Industrial Row, and that the firm had been contracted to do risk mitigation for First Central a month before the robbery. He found that the supposed yellow jacket that a witness had described matched the uniform of a courier service, Quick Transit, which worked out of 343 Harbor Street and had been subcontracted by Paloma Secure. He found receipts that placed Lex Farrow in the same coffee shop as Darnell Pierce the afternoon before the robbery, buying him a jacket as a favor. He found bank transfers to an account in a corporate shell based out of an LLC at 206 Seabourn. Every paper he turned over showed either willful carelessness or a precise, deliberate interweaving. At night, he sat at the municipal archives and pulled microfiche. He discovered an email exchange between a mid-level manager at First Central, a woman named Marisol Vega, who lived at 18 Palmetto Lane, and a man in security. The email was bland, about audit compliance, but buried in its metadata were references to special handling of a marked shipment. He discovered a ledger entry in the bank's internal audit log that had been edited with a timestamp of November 11th, 2013, the day before the robbery, and the editor account was registered to a temp worker who had since disappeared. Piece by piece, the edifice of an outside gang became less solid, until the idea of an inside job looked less like a hypothesis and more like a taxonomy of small acts. Royal did not publish what he found. Instead, he used it for each person he believed responsible, and he let probability and pattern guide his decisions. He created pressure points. He exposed one man's liaison to a money laundering ring by making a small, anonymous complaint to Internal Revenue. He mailed thin packets of personal photos and half-truths to another's home, ensuring the family would find them. For some, he orchestrated what looked like corporate embarrassment, an email leak that suggested a prosecutor had been cozy with a witness. For others, he forced public humiliation, a stain in a newspaper column that would be repeated on evening broadcasts. The point was not to kill. It was to reveal, to make the city's power structure taste the fear they'd once doled out. There were rules he kept. Never the family, never the children, never physical harm that would result in death. He aimed for reputational ruin and professional paralysis. He wanted the city to feel unstable, to know that the tidy narrative of culpability could be unraveled. He watched people contort under pressure and felt his long-suppressed anger reconfigure into something like justice. And yet, the human heart is a complicated instrument, and the sound of his victories didn't always satisfy him. When Judge Henley resigned after a series of alleged ethics violations, the result of a dossier anonymously mailed to the press, Royal felt a hollow win. The judge's career ended, but the man who'd sentenced him was a private citizen who moved to a retirement community in Santa Mesa and rarely left his home on 1012 Oak Ridge Drive. Royal would pass by his house, sometimes on sunset runs, and there was a time he considered leaving a note. This was for Carla. He never did. Something in him understood that physical impossibilities and moral exhaustion conspired to make vengeance a lesser currency than he'd imagined. In the months that followed, the city convulsed between shame and obsession. The DA's office scrambled to distance itself from Whitcomb. She transferred districts with an odd resignation. Marcus Heller's career crumbled as internal audits showed he had been negligent on several past cases. Negligence that, in a new climate, translated into a man's ruined life. Lex Farrow, who had once worn a smirk, lowered his head and tried to reconstruct a life in anonymity. Darnell Pierce, who was supposedly disappeared, was eventually found in a motel 2 counties over with a shaved head and a new name. He refused to speak to the press. Royal's actions had consequence after consequence, some planned and some accidental. A false lead he sent to a local cop triggered an illegal raid on an unrelated small business at 76 Crane Alley, resulting in several civil suits against the city. The news cycle turned the affair into a televised morality play. Was Royal a vigilante hero exposing a rotten machine, or a dangerous man tearing at the city's fabric with no regard for collateral damage? The answers were messy. Even Lena's coverage, which had started as a defense, now asked hard questions about the ethics of retribution. He had never wanted this scale of chaos. He had simply been a man seeking to lift the blanket that had been laid over his life. But a worry, a slow, suffocating worry, took root. Had he become what the system had always feared? Had his anger, in the absence of proof of his innocence, turned him into the sort of man who did the very thing he'd been accused of? He almost stopped. He considered walking away from the ledger and letting the courts do whatever courts do now that their error had been illuminated. But when the Innocence Project released a public statement that included Royal's name and recommended a retrial, the DA's office, pressed by their own internal politics, refused to move fast. The inertia of institutions is a stubborn thing. They prefer small, safe gestures to the messy business of admitting error. Royal felt that old pre-trial fear again. A man who had been burned once by structure would watch it smolder, but never fully die. In the end, the city forced his hand in an unexpected way. Carlisle Thomas, a junior analyst at First Central Savings who had been promoted after the robbery and who lived at 90 Juniper Ridge, made a brash public statement on social media undermining the Innocence Project's motion. Carlisle taunted the idea of Royal's innocence with a tone that landed like a slap. He posted pictures of Royal's apartment building as if to suggest Royal had staged his return. When an auditorium at the bank held a ribbon cutting for a new era, and Carlisle sneered openly at the cameras, something in Royal snapped. He walked into First Central Savings one morning in late spring wearing a dark coat and carrying nothing more than a folder. He approached the customer service desk at 9:10 a.m. with a soft, unremarkable confusion in his expression. The security guard, an ex-Marine named Jonas Valles who lived at 212 Highland, recognized him. Jonas's mouth tightened and he called out, "Hey." Royal placed the folder on the counter and asked if he could speak with a manager. The manager, a rotund man named Alan Briggs, who lived at 16 Palisade Court and had been part of the audit that had been noted in the metadata, came out to the lobby. Royal's voice was steady. "I'd like to review the bank's incident log for November 2013, he said. "Public record." Alan laughed in a way that sounded like broken glass. "You have no right here. You were convicted." Royal slid back a single sheet from the folder. It was a printout, an internal messaging thread between the security firm and bank management, aligned by an employee scheduling special handling on November 11th. It was in itself not proof of murder, but suggestive of complicity. But Royal had done something else. He had arranged for the back office to be empty that day by anonymously calling to complain about an electrical issue at the exact hour that the manager normally rotated. He walked out the revolving door with the same steadiness he'd used to walk into a prison cafeteria. The city watched, always watching. The DA launched a counter-investigation into the Innocence Project and Lena for alleged harassment. Lena received subpoenas. The courts, which had once been a place Royal had hoped would deliver him a clean verdict, now looked like a contaminated well. 2 months later, with the city's attention elsewhere and Royal's list reduced to a handful of people, a final, quieter chapter closed. He received an email, no header, no signature, with a single sentence and an attached photograph. "We did it for you. See." The photograph showed a dated payment slip and a hand with a stump of a ring finger. The file accompanying it contained internal bank audit logs that showed a previously redacted name, Marisol Vega. Marisol had gone missing the week before, and her home at 18 Palmetto Lane had been cleared out. The press called it a new twist. The DA called it a criminal intimidation attempt. The Innocence Project called it actionable evidence. Royal did not celebrate. He folded the photograph into a drawer and closed it. For a long time, he had believed that exposing the truth would be clean and restorative. Now he understood that truth is a fractured thing, and when raised into daylight, it often splintered into sharp shards that cut everyone. When the DA finally agreed to a hearing to re-examine the case, they did so with great reluctance and much rhetoric. On a wet Wednesday in November, in Courtroom 2B at the county courthouse on 600 Justice Way, the prosecution withdrew key charges as new evidence came to light. The televised hearings were anticlimactic. The public was exhausted. The city was tired of the melodrama. The judge, an interim appointed to manage the torrent, read the motion in a voice that smelled of the business he was in. Given new material evidence, the court orders a re-examination. Royal's name was cleared in the sense that the DA dropped the most egregious counts. But the legal system did not live up to Royal's inner mythos of redemption. No parade was held on Marigold Avenue. No plaque was hung at First Central. Carla Espinoza and Tommy Hargreaves were still gone, and no one could bring them back. Lex Farrow remained a complicated figure who might yet be re-prosecuted. Darnell Pierce, when finally located, signed an affidavit recanting his earlier testimony, confessing to having been bribed by an unidentified intermediary. The man was jailed for perjury and for failing to meet other obligations, but the stain of having led a man to prison could not be erased. When asked in one rare interview, a short, controlled segment with Lena McCullough, whether he felt vindicated, Royal answered in a way that would not make for dramatic headlines. "Vindication is not a feeling," he said. "It's a paperwork status. It does not make up for 10 years of early mornings and a mother watching a son leave in a headlock of suspicion. It does not bring back those who died. Suspicion. It does not bring back those who died." He had set out, originally, to punish those who had taken his life with their assumptions. What he had become in the course of trying to demolish a lie was a man who had to live with the knowledge of what secrecy and exposure can do. The city's pulse beat on. The coffee shops still serve lattes on Marigold. First Central rebranded and installed new cameras. The DA's office hired a new public relations firm. Pedestrians still crossed at 14th and Marigold to the rhythm of the walk signs. But Royal no longer ran on Cedar Promenade in the early morning. He walked slowly down to the harbor and watched the water. He kept his ledger and his dry erase board, but he kept them folded away. In the end, the person who had orchestrated many of the leaks, the person who signed the email with a C, was never unmasked in public. Some speculated it had been a disillusioned bank employee, a Paloma Secure operative who had a conscience, or a variety of small actors acting out of petty resentments and broader collusion. The city loved mysteries it couldn't solve. They made for gossip an investment in the illusion that, in a complex world, there remains a singular villain to point at. Royal remarried 10 years after his release. He did so quietly, in a small ceremony at the registry office on Marina Boulevard. His wife, Nina Okiye, was a nurse he met at a community health clinic where he volunteered occasionally, sorting paperwork late at night. She understood modular grief and the way some people carry their histories in the hinge of their jaw. They lived modestly in a 2-bedroom above a laundromat at 44 Seward Lane, and he found a job teaching financial literacy to recently released men and women at a transitional program, where he explained how to open accounts, how to avoid predatory lenders, and how to read fine print. He did not talk about revenge to his students. He taught them, instead, to keep a paper trail. Sometimes, on nights when the city is quiet and the harbor water takes the moon like a spoon, he dreams of the day in the bank as a film. Slow clips of balloons of smoke, of scar tile, of Tommy's final breath like a wind through a reed. In that dream, he is not pleading for his life on a courthouse floor. He is simply walking down Marigold with a child on his shoulders, handing a coffee to the man at the corner cart who remembers names. When he wakes, he turns on the small radio and listens to news about other people's crimes and other people's incomplete justice. He knows now that the world is built not of concluding sentences, but of clauses, of if, and unless, and perhaps, and maybe. Of if, and unless, and perhaps, and maybe. Path through its arteries with a carefully controlled flame. He had found an odd sort of satisfaction in watching the powerful quail and the careless tremble. He had also discovered, painfully, that the flames he used to warm himself would never become a hearth. Those who want neat endings will always be disappointed. For Royal, there was no cinematic scene of him walking into the sunset, victorious and whole. There was only the slow labor of living after a life had been broken and the work of rebuilding without spectacle. He had been framed, and he had, in his own way, answered. The city had been made to reevaluate itself, And perhaps that was the only vengeance that mattered. The stubborn enlightenment of scrutiny, the slow, tender hope that audits would get serious, that prosecutors would be more careful, that juries would be forced to see people rather than caricatures. On a rain-slick morning, years after the first robbery, Royal walked down Marigold and paused at 1424. The bank's windows glinted new and unblemished. He touched the stone where Tommy and Carla had fallen with the gentleness of someone who knows the weight of absence. He left a single folded note under a potted fern near the entrance. For what was taken, "I'm sorry I could not do more." It was not an apology to them, just an admission that the world had taken their breaths and his, and there is no accounting for what that does to the rest of a life. He walked away without looking back. The city made noise. People went on. Justice, imperfect and slow, putters forward like a tired engine. And somewhere in Royal's small, ordered apartment above the laundromat, on a shelf with a bonsai and a stack of legal pamphlets, there sat a dry erase board with a single line left uncrossed. It read, "Truth, leave it to the living."